Do you still remember the sound? The bright ring of a bicycle bell on a summer afternoon. The name Schwinn catching the light along a steel frame. The first long coast downhill with both hands off the bars. For 2 generations of American children, that bell was the sound of freedom. A first taste of going somewhere on your own. Today, the factories that built those bikes sit empty. Concrete shells in Chicago and in the Mississippi Delta, quiet as churches on a Monday. Here is the puzzle. In 1914, Schwinn was the largest bicycle maker in the world and held more than a quarter of the American market. 1 bike in 4 carried the name. By 1992, the company had filed for bankruptcy, and the family that built it walked away with almost nothing. How does an empire die from the weight of its own success? The easy answer is that Schwinn stopped seeing the future. The easy answer is wrong. Schwinn saw nearly every turn in the road before its rivals did. The safety bicycle, the balloon tire, the banana seat, the mountain bike, built on its own cast-off frames. They saw all of it. The question was they kept refusing to believe their own eyes. To understand the fall, you have to begin in a small farming town southwest of Frankfurt. Ignaz Schwinn was born on April 1, 1860, in Hardheim in the Grand Duchy of Baden, the second of 7 children. His father, Frank, was a master carpenter, and to earn that title a man had to build a masterpiece. Frank Schwinn built a pump organ. More than a century later, it still plays. Frank died when Ignaz was 11. The boy left school, apprenticed to a machinist, and learned to read a tolerance the way other men read a newspaper. Then he found the machine that would hold him for the rest of his life. Through the 1880s, most riders still perched atop the high-wheeler, the penny farthing, fast and elegant, and ready to throw a man over the bars at the first stone in the road. Ignaz looked at it and saw a dead end. What caught him instead was the safety bicycle, invented in England in 1885 by John Starley. 2 wheels of equal size, a chain driving the rear, the shape every bicycle has worn ever since. He helped a German manufacturer named Heinrich Kleyer build some of the first ones in the country. Then the 2 men fell out over the design of a coaster brake, and Ignaz made the choice that would echo for 100 years. In 1891, he and his wife Helen boarded a ship for America. Chicago in 1891 was the loudest city in America, and the loudest thing in it was the bicycle. More than 300 makers crowded the river wards, turning out 2 of every 3 bicycles sold in the country. Ignaz spoke little English. He took the jobs he could get, managing production for one firm and then another. And he chafed. A man who can specify a machine to the thousandth of an inch does not want to build another man's design forever. His chance arrived in 1894, in the person of a meat packer. Adolf Arnold had made his money in the Chicago stockyards and his name at the Haymarket Produce Bank. And he had the one thing Ignaz lacked: capital. The engineer and the banker shook hands, and in 1895, they founded Arnold, Schwinn and Company, naming their flagship line the World, a word chosen to promise strength and permanence. The promise was tested almost at once. The craze that built Chicago crashed as fast as it had risen. By 1905, annual sales had fallen to a quarter of their peak, and of the city's 300 makers, 12 remained. The industry's answer was consolidation. A.G. Spaulding and Albert Pope assembled a trust, the American Bicycle Company, that swallowed some 75% of American production and meant to dictate prices to whoever was left. Ignaz never joined it. He had read its books and seen the rot underneath the money. The trust went bankrupt in 1903, Schwinn was still standing, and Ignaz went shopping, buying the tooling and patents of dead rivals for cents on the dollar. In 1908, he bought out Arnold and became sole owner. No partner, no board to persuade. He could bet the whole company on whatever he saw coming. And what he saw coming was the engine. The automobile and the motorcycle were turning the adult bicycle into a relic. So Ignaz bought his way into the new century. He acquired the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing Company, and in December 1912, an Excelsior became the first motorcycle ever officially timed at 100 miles an hour. In 1914, he built the largest motorcycle factory in the world. In 1917, he added Henderson, and by the late 1920s, Excelsior Henderson ran third in America, behind only Indian and Harley-Davidson. The motorcycles brought the speed and the headlines. The bicycle paid the bills. By 1914, Schwinn was the largest bicycle maker on Earth and held more than a quarter of the American market, one machine in four. And into that company, fresh from an engineering degree, walked Ignaz's son, Frank W. Schwinn had grown up on the factory floor. He knew the sound a good weld made and the sound a bad one made, and he would need both before long. The crash came in October 1929. Ignaz was near 70, and he had lived through panics before. This was not a panic, this was the floor giving way. By 1931, with the motorcycle division still profitable and its order book still full, he gathered his department heads and told them the company was done building motorcycles, effective that day. The room argued. He did not. A motorcycle was a luxury, and in a depression luxury dies first. The bicycle, cheap and useful, was the lifeboat. He climbed into it and pushed the rest overboard. His son turned the retreat into a revolution. On a trip to Europe, Frank had watched bicycles glide over rough streets on fat, cushioned tires, and he came home certain. He pushed a rubber maker to mold him a balloon tire 2 and 1/8 inches wide, then dressed it in sheet metal, styled like a motorcycle, false fuel tank and all. The 1933 motorbike rode heavy. The 1934 Aerocycle rode beautiful. Together they remade the American bicycle into the cruiser every paperboy in the country would straddle. The market answered. Industry sales had crawled below 300,000 a year through 1933, crossed 500,000 in 1934, and reached 1.2 million by 1936. By 1935, nearly every new bicycle sold in America rolled on balloon tires. Frank had seen it coming, and this time the company believed him. Frank wanted more than the children's market. He wanted respect. In 1938, he launched the Paramount, a hand-built racing machine of chrome molybdenum steel and brass-brazed lugs, made in small numbers by a master frame builder named Emil Waston. The Paramount never made real money. It was never meant to. It was a flag planted at the front of the field, proof that the name stamped on a cheap paperboy bike also belonged on the champions. On May 17, 1941, on a closed stretch of Old Highway 99 near Bakersfield, the cyclist Alfred Lederner drafted a race car to 108.92 miles an hour on a Paramount. He was the first man in history to ride a bicycle past 100. Then, the country went to war, and Schwinn went with it. From 1942, the lines that had bent bicycle frames turned out shell casings and aircraft parts. And as the men shipped overseas, their mothers and wives and sisters took their places at the machines. When the soldiers came home to a baby boom, demand exploded. And Frank made his boldest wager yet. Around 1950, he walked away from the department stores that had long sold most of his bikes under their own private labels, and built instead a network of independent dealers who could carry Schwinn and nothing else. To sell them, he put movie stars in the catalogs, and the bicycle stopped being a toy and became a piece of the American good life. The strategy made the brand untouchable. It also chained the company to one way of selling, to one kind of store, to one definition of what Schwinn was. That loyalty would come due. For a while, every bet paid off. The soldiers came home, the suburbs filled with children, and Schwinn sat at the dead center of the American childhood. Its bikes were heavy, durable, and guaranteed for life, the kind a man bought once and handed down to his son. No name in the country meant more. The first hint that the ground was shifting blew in from across the Atlantic. Lightweight English 3 speeds began landing on American docks, courting grown men who wanted to ride for exercise in the new suburbs. And they made a Schwinn cruiser look like what it was, a heavy machine built for a child. Schwinn's answer, in 1960, was the Varsity, an affordable 10-speed that put a derailleur within reach of an ordinary family, and coaxed millions of grown Americans back onto 2 wheels. It was a genuine triumph of sales. It was also, to a serious rider, the heaviest lightweight ever built. Hold that thought. Then came the bicycle that drew a whole generation's picture of freedom. In 1962, Schwinn's West Coast man noticed something odd in Southern California. Kids were stripping their bikes to the frame and rebuilding them to look like their older brothers' chopper motorcycles. Small wheels, long banana seats, ape-hanger handlebars reaching for the sky. He called Chicago. The director of research, Al Fritz, flew out, took one look, and understood. This was not a passing fad. This was a generation telling you what it wanted. Fritz built a prototype, and Schwinn's own management laughed at it. No parent, they said, would pay for anything so ridiculous. He talked them into a small run anyway, and in 1963, the Stingray reached the dealers. The first production run sold out in a matter of months, more than 45,000 bikes before the factory could catch its breath. By the end of 1964, bicycles in the Stingray style made up roughly 70% of every bike sold in America. It became the best-selling model the company would ever make. Schwinn pushed the idea to its limit, into slick-tired fastbacks, into frame-mounted stick shifters, and in 1968, into the crate line with its drag strip names and its front disc brake, a child's bicycle that cost as much as a working man's tools. This was the summit. Design, manufacturing, and marketing all turning together like one well-cut machine. And it was here, at the very top, that the first cracks opened. In 1963, Frank W. Schwinn died, and the company passed to his son, Frank Valentine Schwinn. The empire looked invincible, and that was precisely the danger. Sure of its heavy steel and its loyal dealers, Schwinn went in on running the Chicago plant on methods and tooling laid down in the 1930s. While frame builders in Japan and Europe moved to lighter alloys and cleaner welds, the Paramount, once the proof of American craft, was quietly slipping behind the field it had once led. The same loyalty that built the empire now drew the government's eye. The exclusive territories, the franchise dealers, the iron rule that a Schwinn be sold one way and one way only. In 1967, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Arnold, Schwinn and Company, that those practices violated the antitrust laws. The figures buried in the case told the quieter story. In 1951, Schwinn had held the largest share of the American market, better than a fifth of every bike sold. By 1961, that share had been cut nearly in half, while the rival who sold through the mass merchandisers had almost doubled his. The ruling itself would be reversed a decade later. The trend it had measured would not. The trend arrived as a boom. In the early 1970s, millions of adult Americans discovered the bicycle, not as a child's toy, but as exercise, as recreation, as a way to move through the gas lines of an oil-shocked decade. They wanted what Europe and Japan were already building. Light, quick 10 speeds with thin tires and clean welds. Schwinn answered with the Varsity and the Continental, honest and durable. And made of the same electro-forged steel the company had been pouring since the 1930s. With a kickstand bolted on that no serious rider wanted, here is the bike you were asked to hold in mind. The heaviest lightweight ever built. The customers were asking for sports cars, and Schwinn kept handing them tanks. Across the ocean, Peugeot and Nishiki and Fuji moved to lighter alloys and finer joints. And with every model year, the distance grew. Schwinn's loyalty to its own machinery, the very discipline that had saved it in 1903, was now quietly bleeding it. The strangest part of the story is not that Schwinn missed the future. It is that Schwinn saw the future, held it in its hands, and set it down. In the early 1970s, kids in Southern California were hauling their Stingrays onto dirt lots to race and jump them. And a sport called BMX was being born on Schwinn's own frames. The company called it dangerous, called it a fad, and stayed out until the upstarts owned the field, then offered a scrambler too heavy to matter. The mountain bike cut deeper still. In the hills of Marin County, a few riders went hunting for frames tough enough to bomb down a fire road. And what they pulled from the junk shops were the fat-tired Schwinn cruisers of the late 1930s. Gary Fisher and Joe Breeze built the first mountain bikes on those old bones. When the idea reached Schwinn's engineers, they could not picture a grown man paying good money to ride a bicycle into the mud. In 1981, Specialized shipped the first mass-produced mountain bike, the Stump Jumper. Schwinn followed years later, out of breath, trailing a parade it could have led. The cracks in the products ran straight back to the people. In October 1979, Edward Schwinn Jr., 30 years old, took the presidency from his uncle Frank. For decades, the family had lived off its factory, running paid-for tooling year after year, and sending the cash home to relatives rather than back into the machines. They had eaten the seed corn. The bill came due all at once. Inflation was tearing at wages. The 80-year-old Chicago plant leaked and groaned. And in the fall of 1980, the workers, newly joined to the United Auto Workers, walked off the line, 1,400 of them. The strike ran 13 weeks, and when it settled in early 1981, something older than any contract had broken. The trust between family and craftsmen who had carried its name for generations. Management did not rebuild the plant. It abandoned it, shutting Chicago for good in 1983. By then, Schwinn had already gone east. First to Panasonic in Japan then, as the yen climbed, to a young and hungry Taiwanese firm called Giant. The arithmetic was merciless. The parts alone for an American-built Varsity could cost what a Taiwanese plant charged for the whole finished bike. To get the quality it demanded, Schwinn taught Giant everything it knew. Its standards, its methods, its hard-won sense of how a good frame goes together. Giant was a brilliant student. Within a few years, it was building most of Schwinn's bicycles, and in 1981, the very year it made itself indispensable, it began quietly selling bikes under its own name. There was one last bet, and it was poured in concrete. In 1981, to escape the Union and win back the words, "Made in USA," Schwinn built a fresh factory in Greenville, Mississippi. It was isolated by accident and crippled by geography, 60 miles from the nearest railhead, and a continent away from the West Coast ports where the Asian parts came ashore. People joked it was easier to ship a frame from Chicago to Taiwan than from Chicago to Greenville. The plant could not find the skilled hands the Chicago floor once held, and it never turned a profit in a single year of its existence, and the chain that once held the empire together now pulled it apart. Desperate to lift the brand, Schwinn began opening company-owned stores, and in doing so, turned on the independent dealers who had sold its bikes, and only its bikes, for 30 years. Those dealers had been the moat. Now they felt betrayed, hung other brands on the wall, and let Trek and Specialized and Giant ride straight through the gap. That loyalty, the thing Frank Schwinn built in 1950, had finally come due. The last dependable profit was the Airdyne exercise bike, until cheaper rivals undercut that too. By 1990, the company was losing money, nearly $3 million in a single year, and its debts to its own Asian suppliers were climbing faster than it could pay. On October 4, 1991, in Greenville, a worker finished the last bicycle of the shift, switched off the lights, and locked his station. No ceremony, no speech. After 96 years, Schwinn had stopped building bicycles in the United States. The men and women who truly understood the trade had already drifted off, many of them to Trek and Specialized, carrying decades of knowledge to the companies now burying their old employer. Edward Schwinn made one final miscalculation. Certain the banks would never dare push an American icon into its grave. He refused them a credible plan and dared them to move. They called the bluff. They shifted his loans to the workout desks, and they squeezed. In October 1992, Schwinn filed for Chapter 11. The vultures were already circling. Sam Zell, an investor known as the grave dancer for the money he made off dying companies, led the Zell Chillmark Fund that bought what remained in 1993 for about $43 million. After nearly 100 years of sweat, the family walked away with almost nothing. The new owners swept out the old Chicago hands, moved headquarters to Boulder, Colorado, and kept the one asset that still carried weight. The name, the bloodline that had run 4 generations deep, was severed, and the word Schwinn rolled on with not a single Schwinn behind it. Almost. In a small shop in Wisconsin, one Schwinn was still building. When the creditors carved up the company, Richard Schwinn, great-grandson of Ignaz, joined a frame builder named Mark Muller, and bought the old Paramount shop in Waterford, where the finest Schwinn racing frames had been brazed for years. The bankruptcy terms were unsparing. Richard could not call his bicycles Schwinns. He could not use the Paramount name his own family had made famous. So he called them Waterfords, and went on doing the one thing the family had always truly known how to do: build a steel frame by hand, one at a time, the way Ignaz had built them in Chicago 100 years before. A couple thousand a year, each one cut and brazed and aligned by people who could still hear the difference between a good joint and a bad one. He kept at it for 30 years. Then, in June of 2023, with his oldest hands ready to retire and no one behind them to carry it on, Richard Schwinn closed the doors. "The streak is over," he said. The last Schwinn in the bicycle trade hung up his apron, and a line of work that began in a German machine shop in the 1880s came quietly to its end. So return to the question we started with: how does an empire that saw everything coming end up buried beneath it? The The answer was never blindness. Schwinn watched the safety bicycle arrive and built one. It watched the balloon tire and bet the company on it. It watched a generation invent the Stingray, the BMX, the mountain bike, more than once on Schwinn's own discarded frames. And every time it saw the thing clearly and could not bring itself to believe what it saw, the empire did not die of ignorance. It died of disbelief, of a slow, comfortable certainty that what had worked would keep working, that the dealers would stay loyal, that the name would be enough. It was not enough. There is a warning in that, for anyone who has been good at one thing for a long time. The future rarely arrives looking like a threat. More often it shows up as a toy, a fad, a thing the kids are doing in a dirt lot, easy to see and easier to dismiss. What remains is not in any factory. It is in the garage, where a rusted cruiser leans against the wall. It is at the auction, where a restored crate sells for more than a workingman once made in a month. It is in the memory of a first ride down a summer street with both hands off the bars, the bell ringing, the whole world swinging open. Schwinn pressed that feeling into steel and sold it for a generation. The steel outlasted the company. The feeling outlasted them both. If you ever rode a Schwinn, you already know the end of this story in your hands. So tell us, what was the name on your first bicycle, and where did it carry you? Leave it in the comments. The people who remember these machines are getting harder to find, and your memory might be the one that makes a stranger smile tonight. If this story meant something to you, tap the like and pass it along to someone who would understand it. And if you want more evenings like this one, stay with us. Subscribe, and we will ride again soon.